And now, for the very reason we've come together, I'm pleased to welcome Lincoln Torch Club member Carol Levin, who will now introduce tonight's guest presenter. Carol?
I am so beyond thrilled to have the opportunity to introduce Elaine. And I think all of us who know Elaine know that she is one of the most outgoing people we've ever known and one of the most generous. Elaine taught at Nebraska Wesleyan for 24 years. She was the Hugie Chair. She's also, and I think it's obvious that she was one of the most beloved by her students who adore her and stay in touch with her. One of the other things I just wanted to mention about Elaine is how extremely adventurous she is. Elaine loves to collect firsts, and she's been doing it her whole life. First time in a place, first new experience. She has so many firsts now, but she's still looking for more. I know that you are really going to enjoy Elaine's talk. She told me I had to be brief. I could go on about how wonderful Elaine is for hours, but I'm going to turn it over to her so she can tell us all about Holy Smokes.
Thank you very much, Carol. Okay, let's go ahead and then Elaine, we're ready for you whenever you would like to start.
I'm working with Mark Domke, so he's going to put the screen up there. Okay, there we go. I was born on Armistice Day. Many of you will remember that it used to be celebrated on November 11th, and we were to face east with our hands over our hearts at 11 a.m. This was the commemoration of the armistice which ended World War I in 1918. In 1954, it was changed to Veterans Day on the second Monday of November. In 2018, I planned to be at Notre Cathedral for the Armistice Day service, marking the 100th anniversary of the armistice. Suzanne Chagru was with me. Having spent several birthdays in Paris in the past, I knew that the French did not celebrate the armistice at Notre Dame, but the British had held a remembrance service in the cathedral each year since 1924. It was the only day in which Notre Dame was open to an English service, and that was true in 2018. The nave of the cathedral was festooned with flags from each of the countries that fought in the Great War. A beautiful service began with a long procession, including the British ambassador to France, priests from the Anglican churches in Paris, the rector of Notre Dame, the pastor of the American Church in Paris, and bagpipes. We sang the same Te Deum sung by the cathedral choir on Armistice Day 1918. And the bugle used to sound the last post and reveille was that used in 1918 on the Western Front to announce the end of hostilities. The RSCM, Royal School of Church Music, European Cathedral Singers, were guests of the RSCM France for this event. 64 singers supported by a brass ensemble and percussion. There were 2 world premieres, a flute solo and a newly commissioned anthem by Malcolm Archer. The ambassador laid a poppy wreath at the altar. The service included tributes. 5 different men recounted tales from 5 wars of men who had given up their lives in order to save their men. We were reminded of the importance of remembering. Little did we know that within 6 months, we would again be plunged into remembering. On April 15th, 2019, a major fire destroyed much of the interior of Notre Dame. This magnificent cathedral had its origins in the vision of one man, Bishop Maurice de Sully, who in 1160 contracted an architect to design a new church for the Ile de la Cité, where Notre Dame is located, with financial backing of the king. Construction required demolishing houses and two existing churches, one the Romanesque cathedral, to replace it with the new Gothic-style cathedral as erected at Chartres and Saint-Denis. The first stone was laid in June 1163 in a lavish ceremony attended by Pope Alexander III. The new cathedral, dedicated to the Virgin Mary, Notre Dame, Our Lady, cost a fortune and took nearly 2 centuries to complete. The high altar was consecrated in 1182, and Sully was able to celebrate the first Mass, but he died in 1196, long before it was finally finished in 1345. As architectural historian Andrew Talon demonstrated in his 2010 laser reconstruction, flying buttresses were introduced early in the building of the cathedral to support the vaults. We would like to fantasize that Sully's beautiful church flourished from 1345 to 2019, but it had a much more checkered past. Notre Dame was tied to the monarchy, but kings were crowned at the Cathedral of Reims and buried at Saint-Denis. In 1430, Notre Dame was the setting for the coronation of Henry VI of England as the King of France, the only coronation held there. In 1455, a ceremony was held to rehabilitate Joan of Arc. In 1558, Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, married Francois, the eldest son of King Henry II of France and the Dauphin, heir to the throne, in Notre Dame. In 1572, the Huguenot, King Henry IV, married Marguerite de Valois, daughter of Henry II and Catherine de' Medici, but he could only stand at the door of Notre Dame while she was in the chancel, since he was a Protestant. He later converted and had his famous saying, "Paris is well worth a Mass." Over the years, its upkeep was neglected. In 1699, the choir screen was demolished. Later, some of the stained glass was removed to let in more light. In the 18th century, the central portal was demolished to allow processions to move more freely. And the cathedral, previously colored, was whitewashed. Then came the French Revolution. The leaders of the revolution were steeped in Enlightenment thought, which critiqued the Catholic Church and embraced reason. Anti-clericalism grew when the church supported the monarchy, and many priests were reluctant to sign the civil constitution of the clergy. In 1793, a mob threw down the statues on the outer facade of Notre Dame, known as the Gallery of Kings, and either knocked off or, I've even heard, guillotined their heads. A number of these kings' heads were recovered by accident in 1977 and are now on display at the Musée Cluny in central Paris. And these are a few of those heads. There are conflicting interpretations of this iconoclasm. The first holds that the Vandals mistook the statues as representations of kings and decapitated them in an anti-monarchical fit when they were actually statues of saints. The second contends that this vandalism took place in October 1793 as part of de-Christianization gripping France. They took down 21 statues of the kings of Judea and 36 statues from the South Portal. One historian even claims that they were workers paid by a man named Varin in charge of clearing the cathedral of imagery. A pile of rubble was left behind. The following year, Robespierre, wishing to stop the rampage of de-Christianization, engineered a ceremony declaring the cathedral was now a temple of reason, celebrating the supreme being. In preparation, some of the rubble had to be cleared away. Robespierre held his ceremony of the Feast of Reason in Notre Dame on November 10th, 1793. An improvised mountain was set in the nave with a Greek temple dedicated to philosophy, decorated with busts of philosophers. At the base was an altar dedicated to reason with a torch to truth in the front. An opera singer was dressed in blue, white, and red and represented the goddess of liberty. He followed this up with a more elaborate ceremony on a fabricated mountain in the Tuileries garden, in which he was the major figure. But political winds changed and he was arrested and guillotined. In 1796, complaints by Parisians of the smell and sight of the rubble led to it being sold as building materials for the Hôtel Dieu, which was the hospital in that area. When Lacanal, a lawyer, was building a mansion at 10 Rue de la Chaussée d'Antin, he found the heads and buried them and walled them up. He died before the 1801 Concordat, settling the conflict between the Catholic Church and the French government. It was in 1977 that man cleaning up his grounds tore down the wall and found the heads. In the later years of the revolution, the cathedral was neglected, used for wine and grain storage. Then Napoleon took power in France. On Easter Sunday in 1802, he orchestrated a solemn Te Deum in Notre Dame, marking the signing of the Concordat, which ended the rift between the Holy See and the French nation, which had occurred with the civil constitution of the clergy in 1791. This marked the final restoration of the cathedral to full church control. The archbishops and bishops clasped hands with Napoleon, the first consul, and Catholicism was declared, quote, the religion of the majority of the French people, end quote. To show who was really to be worshipped, Napoleon had an illuminated star 9 meters in diameter, hoisted from the towers of Notre Dame on the eve of his birthday, and declared the following day, August 15th, previously known as Assumption Day, commemorating the ascension of the Virgin Mary into heaven, to be a national holiday as Napoleon's birthday. In 1804, he was transformed from first consul to emperor of the French by means of a plebiscite and a coronation ceremony in Notre Dame. So the great church was cleaned up for the ceremony. Jacques-Louis David moved the choir screen and put up a painted tableau for the event. He also painted a massive painting of the event, which was not finished till 1807. And these are excerpts from that painting, which you can see at the Louvre anytime you're there. As depicted in the painting, the Pope presided over the coronation of both Napoleon and his wife Josephine, with all the court figures looking on. After being anointed by the Pope, Napoleon, like Charlemagne, seized the crown and first crowned himself and then Josephine. But once again, the church fell into decline in the 19th century, only to be resurrected partially as a result of the triumph of Victor Hugo's novel, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, in French known as Notre Dame de Paris, published in 1831. Hugo, in chapter 3, rhapsodized, quote, the Church of Notre Dame in Paris is doubtless still a sublime and majestic edifice today, but notwithstanding the beauty that it has retained, even in its old age, one cannot help feeling grief and indignation at the numberless injuries and mutilations that time and man have inflicted on the venerable structure. Then he went on to describe the dissolute state of the cathedral. Following a popular outcry, the architect Eugene Emmanuel Viollet-le-Duc was hired to renovate Notre Dame. Viollet-le-Duc replaced the 28 statues of kings in the Gallery of Kings, restored the door between the two towers, placed gargoyles, as you see these gargoyles here, and other monsters on the roof, and erected the spire we all saw fall on April 15th. He worked on this for nearly 25 years. Under Napoleon III, Baron Haussmann reconfigured the city and tore down many houses on the Ile de la Cité, providing a vista for Notre Dame for Parisians, tourists, and artists alike to truly see Notre Dame from a distance to get a sense of the whole beauty of the building. Coming to the 20th century, the city was once again in danger in the Nazi era. I'm going to tell you something now, but I have not been able to authenticate this story. In anticipation of the Nazi takeover of Paris, French women reportedly dismantled the 3 rose windows, taking out the stained glass piece by piece, marking them with chalk to indicate their proper location, and hid them, replacing them with plain glass. William Shire, in his Berlin diary, wrote on June 18, 1940, "We walked down the Seine to Notre Dame. Inside the cathedral, the light was too strong, with the original rose window and the 2 transept windows out." The stained glass was returned after the liberation of Paris. Originally, Hitler intended Paris to be protected from bombing, but when the American troops were nearing in 1944, he ordered the destruction of the city, and so it was all wired up to blow it up. But the order was never carried out. General de Gaulle arrived, marched down the Champs-Élysées to Notre Dame, despite snipers who threatened his life, and triumphantly marched down the main aisle of the cathedral. According to Rob Hillestad, a tribute to John F. Kennedy was held in Notre Dame several days after his assassination. Actually, Rob was in an art class in Paris, and his professor said, "Did you know your president was assassinated?" And he said, "Yes, I did know." And he said, "Well, they're having a service in Notre Dame, and you're excused if you want to go." So Rob went. The cathedral was packed with Americans, French, and tourists. Suddenly, there were flashbulbs going off at the great doors, and Rob asked a woman sitting next to him if Madame de Gaulle was entering. "No, she's been here for quite a while," his neighbor informed him. It was Marlene Dietrich parading slowly down the aisle. The cathedral was in need of repair again. Millions of euros were allocated. At the time of the fire, the cathedral had 500 tons of scaffolding embracing the upper roof, and in fact, the spire, that's what it was particularly working on. On April 15th, 2019, the Monday of Holy Week leading up to Easter, while a mass was being celebrated, a fire erupted in the wooden attic framework of the cathedral called the Forest. Although a smoke alarm went off at 6:18 p.m., the guard looked in the sacristy rather than the cathedral itself and said there was no fire. Only about 25 minutes later did flames and smoke alert the rector that Notre Dame was in fact on fire. Firemen were called, and 2, a seasoned fireman and a novice firewoman, were sent up a stair to the top and encountered a firestorm. While the firemen were directed to try to put out the fire with water drawn from the Seine, another pair were ordered to rescue the relics stored in the cathedral. These relics, once kept at the Sainte-Chapelle, were the crown of thorns, a nail from the cross, and a piece of the cross. Initially, the firemen returned triumphantly, carrying the gilded crown, only to be squelched by the rector, who told them that crown was only for display. The real relics were in a safe. A man who knew the combination went back into the falling flaming shards and lead sprays with the firemen. 2, he said. Then he stressed out and forgot the other numbers. Another man was summoned who knew the combination, and finally they rescued the relics. Concerns also remained for the rose windows, other stained glass windows, and the great organ, but miraculously they survived, as did many statues that were very valued. But then a fire was spotted in the North Tower. A meeting was held with the fire captain, the lead fireman, and the president of France, Emmanuel Macron, to make a hard decision. If the fire continued in the tower, the great bells would fall and bring down the tower, which would bring down the other tower, and that would bring down all of Notre Dame. On the other hand, if they sent men up to put out the fire, many men might die. And the head of the fire brigade for Paris was very concerned about that because he'd lost 2 men already that year. And he really didn't want to put his men at risk, but the men said, we're going to go. They had 20 minutes. That was the maximum amount of time before the bells would fall. The decision was to go. They succeeded and no one died. 3 days later, President Macron invited all the Paris firemen to the Élysée Palace for recognition. Macron promised Notre Dame would be restored in 5 years, in time for the Olympics in Paris in 2024. Andrew Talon's charting of the cathedral is being used to reconstitute the building as it was in 2010. This is a drawing of, or a picture of the reconstitution that Talon did. He used lasers and he set them up and put hundreds of them together to make this kind of image to show what the cathedral really looked like. Talon was a Renaissance man. He was very interesting, interested in music, engineering. At one time, he played with the idea of becoming a monk, but eventually he became a master of Gothic architecture, developing a technique of using laser points to reconstruct the skeleton of Gothic cathedrals, and he did any number of cathedrals. He was teaching at Vassar College when he died in 2018 at the age of 49 of brain cancer, a year before the fire. The work has proven to be far harder than anyone anticipated. The lead ceiling continued to disintegrate onto the nave. Lead was deposited on the surface of the stained glass windows and now has to be painstakingly removed. 5 months after the fire, Jacques Chirac, formerly mayor of Paris, prime minister, and then president of France, died. The great bell of Notre Dame, Emmanuel, which weighs 12.8 tons and is housed in the South Tower, tolled in his honor, as was the tradition upon the deaths of presidents. On Christmas Eve 2020, 8 members of the Notre Dame choir were broadcast from the nave of the cathedral, wearing helmets, face shields, and masks. No audience was in the cathedral, but the people of France knew that Notre Dame would live on. The restoration of the cathedral is very costly and controversial, but Macron is committed to it. Huge sums have been donated by friends of Notre Dame at home and abroad. In their eyes, as in mine, Notre Dame is a national treasure. Okay, questions. There's lots I couldn't include.
Sorry, we have lots of questions. That was wonderful and delightful. Thank you, Elaine. And I think we'll just open it up to whomever has questions, go ahead and start. And I think if you're muted or unmuted, I was muted, so perhaps you might want to unmute.
Elaine, you said the cathedral had been painted and then overpainted in white. But when we saw the interior, it looked like stark stone. Has that been scraped or sandblasted off?
No, I think it was just over the years that it started to flake off. And so it, I mean, I was shocked when I found out that initially it had been painted, but because there's no sign of that now. Yeah.
Switch to gallery view. Elaine, I have a question for you. So Leduc was the architect of the 19th century for restoration for the, it was the Gallery of Kings and the two main doors. Was there an expenditure that was published for that renovation?
I didn't see it, but I think if I could find out. I don't know. It was financed by the government, and that's because there was a lot of pressure on them. Everybody read the Hunchback of Notre Dame, and they said, "Hey, we got to do something about this building." So,
Gothic architecture was expensive in every realm that I've read for renovation to bring that back. And so I imagine just looking at that it was just overwhelming. But then again, the upcoming expenditure that they've projected, is there a projected cost for the renovation now?
well, Mark and I were talking about that, that some people say $1 billion, but maybe it'll be more like 5 billion by the time they're done, because costs are up too, compared to what it was in the 19th century. And so it's hard to know.
With the pandemic, building materials have skyrocketed internationally. And so I wondered if they'd started out with an expenditure and then where they might be with that. So thank you.
Initially, the biggest cost was trying to get the old scaffolding out of there. The scaffolding that had been up there to work on the cathedral, they had to get it out because it was destroyed and it was just in the way of doing any restoration. So almost the whole first year was spent just trying to get that scaffolding out.
Elaine, I was sort of fascinated at the number of times things have been done to the cathedral to try and preserve it and restore it and all these sorts of things. And I didn't ever think that that was that typical of a Gothic cathedral. Do you have any comments on that? Is it unusual, the amount of things that Notre Dame has gone through?
I don't know. I haven't compared it to Chartres, for example, but in terms of hiding the stained glass from the Nazis, apparently they did that at Chartres too. There's a whole book about it.
Oh.
And, that was at the time when they were hiding all the paintings and everything in the Louvre too. But as far as just the general rebuilding, I don't know. I really don't know. I haven't spent any time on that. So I can look though.
Okay.
Elaine, speaking of the stained glass, how long did it take to bring back the colored stained glass when it was safe to do so? I mean, what kind of time?
Now?
No, not now. I meant back in the World War II days.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know enough about that. I don't have any good sources. I belong to a listserv called H France, and I put the question out there, and I only got 3 people who would even offer any information. So it's one of those unknown, maybe they never did take the glass out. I don't know. But Shire's comment seems to suggest that he did with at least one of the windows. So I don't know. I know they were afraid because Goering, if you read that new book on Winston Churchill, he talks about Goering, who would swoop up artwork everywhere he went. And I'm sure he had his eye on those things. Yeah. If he could get some goodies there.
Elaine, I think I've seen a couple of headlines since the fire where there was so much money that got pledged, and a lot of big corporations stepped up right away and said that they would, donate all this money, and that I feel like I've seen a couple of headlines that indicate that the money hasn't necessarily come through the way that, it was maybe pledged in the aftermath and the immediate aftermath of the fire. So I was wondering about that, and also about if there's a governing body that's overseeing the donations and the costs to ensure that the money is going where it is indeed supposed to go, if indeed it comes in.
Right, exactly. There's been so much controversy about how the money should be spent. And I would guess that there are groups that are managing the whole thing, probably something out of the government too, but I don't know much about that. But one of the major controversies is whether they should restore it to its old ways or make it much more modern. Okay. And so, for example, the spire, they actually had a competition for people to come up with ideas for how to build the spire. And one person came up with this idea of a stainless steel spire. And another one had some kind of glass spire. And then there was make it out of the way it was before, the old oak that was used. Well, then there was all the environmentalists that said, oh, but you have to cut down so many trees in order to do that. I mean, the figure was something like 1,000 trees. And well, somebody in the legislature said, well, if every town and village in France donated a tree, we'd have the trees. But in fact,
That's crowdsourcing at its finest.
right.
Yeah.
As it is, they're cutting them down from 200 different forests. The major forest, Bercy, there was a big stink about that. They were going to take them all from that, and that would deforest this, which of course it wouldn't deforest it. But looking that up, they said that they were always cutting down these oak trees to make wine barrels.
Elaine,
Yes.
it's still a Roman Catholic church, but is the reconstruction being done by the government?
I think it's being supervised by the government. I don't know how much power the church has. I mean, France is only nominally a Catholic country. So it's a good question, though. I really don't know. Yeah.
About the Catholicism, were they having regular services there before the fire, and have they stopped, or did they no longer have ordinary worship services there?
They were having about 9 masses a day, and I'm sure that if you went to be a tourist, a lot of times you had to stand and wait till they'd let you in after a mass was completed, or you'd kind of tiptoe around the mass. I've done that before. Because they do have regular masses. And now they have, I think they've determined that the structure is, the first year and a half, they were afraid it would just collapse and they weren't going to let anybody in there. But now they feel like they've kind of gotten it together, and I think they are allowing some occasional masses. But mostly what's happening is all the masses that should be at Notre Dame are being done at Saint-Sulpice or one of the other churches that's close by, because they really don't want to risk people's lives, and things keep falling.
Also, there's no cleaning the lead.
Yeah, and there's all that lead. There's just lead. Lead is constantly falling still, and it covers everything. That's one of the big problems, is cleaning out all that lead. Yeah.
Lead seems awfully heavy for a rooftop. Is that where the lead came from, a
Yeah,
rooftop?
it was coating the top, that wooden frame up at the top. There was lead coating that, yeah.
Okay, wow.
And that all melted in the fire.
Sure. Yeah.
And so all the wood shards came down, but all the lead came down too. And that's been such a major undertaking to get that lead off of the stained glass.
Yeah.
Elaine, I put a link in the chat to the Friends of Notre Dame Paris, which is the official nonprofit that is raising funds and coordinating restoration efforts. So
Thank
that-
you, Suzanne. I looked at that site before, but I didn't write it down. I looked at it about an hour ago and thought, oh, look at that. They're even saying up to date where we are, you know, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and they've removed the organs. Now they're working on, they're going to be restoring those as well. So
Now, the big major organ doesn't have much damage, whereas the one in the choir is going to have to be totally restored.
Yeah. So that link's in the chat for people to.
I have a very dear friend who is an organist composer, and when I talked to him a few weeks ago, he said he was just so pleased that the organ hadn't been destroyed because it was the largest, greatest organ in all of France. Yeah.
What happened to the pipes of the organ?
Yeah, that's what they have to clean up. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But apparently the major organ is not damaged that much. It just has lead.
Wow.
Yeah. But at least it's going to function. And that's really thrilling to those who love the music.
Mhm.
When I was any number of times when I was in Paris, I would go to organ concerts on Sunday nights because it's just a great organ.
Mhm.
Thank you, Elaine. Did anyone have more questions? Oh, I see Wayne.
Elaine, I haven't read Victor Hugo's novel, and I'm hoping you have, so you could tell us what you think of it. And if you have, does he get into a lot of the wonderful history that you've told us about tonight?
Well, if I'm going to be honest, I've read about a third of it. I started it, but you know, I've been doing all this other research, and so I have it on discs in my car, and now the library says I have to return that. And I have a copy. I have a copy of the book, but what I can say in answer to your question is that he does go through some of this history, and he gets it all wrong. He keeps saying that it was the architects that destroyed the cathedral, and the architects did this, and for some reason he's got a real thing against architects.
Oh.
He doesn't say that it was revolutionary mobs that did all this damage during the revolution. Oh no, it was the architects.
Oh God.
Oh, well, that's interesting.
Well, it sounds as if there isn't a compelling human interest dimension. When I think of the novel, I think of Quasimodo swinging
Right.
and
no,
gathering up Esmeralda.
But they live in the cathedral, you know, and if she leaves, then he's going to lose her. So so it becomes the setting for the novel, really.
Oh.
But I haven't read the whole thing, I have to be honest. I haven't read all of Les Miserables either.
I suspect you have.
Elaine, I have a question. This is Dean. I'm interested just in the sheer size of Notre Dame versus, let's say, Munster in York or St. Paul's in London. I've been to all three. I think you may have as also. Do you have any feelings on that question?
I don't. I know that it's, you know, like the spire was 310 feet high.
Right.
But I can't really compare them. And the only time I've ever seen any comparison is at St. Peter's in Rome, where you walk down and it says such and such church ends here, and such church ends there. So no, I really don't know. I guess I'm full of I don't know answers tonight, but
Okay.
they're good questions. Right.
These are great questions. I know Wayne Bowles had a question for you too. He was muted. Wayne, are you there?
Am I turned on?
You
There.
You are turned on.
When did you start gathering all this information?
When I decided that I would do a torch talk about it, that's when I started.
What year is that?
It's in the year of the great Sandy Stewart.
All right.
We are blessed to have such a great roster of speakers this year. These are exceptional papers. It's really lively information. And I think perhaps Gothic architecture never got a square deal. You know, for a long time, it didn't get respect. And so it's fun to go back and look at the periods that it did get great respect and that money was sent its way for it to thrive.
Yeah.
Something I didn't know.
And there was a kind of competition, you know, they'd had these old Romanesque cathedrals and then they saw some of these Gothic ones. Well, we have to have a Gothic one too, you know, kind of thing. Yeah. You know, this Andrew Talon is really an interesting fellow. He was born in Belgium, but educated in the United States. And when he was 8, his mother was doing her doctoral dissertation in Paris, and he became fascinated with Notre Dame then. He started just trying to figure out, you know, all of the ins and outs of the building. And then he went to Princeton and was studying music, but he had an engineering class and the guy got him started on doing Gothic cathedrals. And, you know, that was a perfect match for him. And he just went into this totally unique way of studying what they were really like. For example, he found people were saying that the flying buttresses were added in like the 13th or 14th century. And by doing what he did in terms of reconstruction, he could see they were there from the very beginning. So he really has broken through a lot of the myths about Notre Dame and other Gothic. He did Salisbury in England, and he did Chartres, and he did a whole bunch of Gothic cathedrals.
What's his last name? His last name?
Tallon. Talon. I'm giving a French accent.
Very nice.
There's a children's book, and I can't think of the author right now, and I don't want to run and try and find it, but it's called The Cathedral. And it won a children's book award, but literally if you read it, when you're done, you could go out and get stones and build a cathedral.
Yeah, yeah.
It's so beautiful. Are you familiar with that book?
I have it. It's right behind me here. Yeah.
It was one of the early books, and I can't remember the name of the author, but it's called The Cathedral.
It's by Fallon, I think. Let's see.
She's going to get it.
Yeah.
David Macaulay.
Yeah, Macaulay. He spoke here a couple times in the College of Architects.
Oh, Macaulay is a great writer. Yeah, this is the book.
But you can literally build a cathedral if you go through that book. It's an amazing.
And if you want to give a present to your grandchildren, it's a beautiful picture book called God Bless the Gargoyles. And it's about how the gargoyles protect the cathedral. I've given it to my great grandchildren. They have this book, don't you? Yeah, yeah.
I have a question.
Yes.
Elaine, was the spire there from the very beginning?
That is a fabulous question, Martha. It
No
was,
wonder I'm confused.
no, it was added after about 3 centuries. And then right in the 18th century, before the French Revolution, it was in such bad shape that it just kind of collapsed and they took it down. And then in the 19th century, then the Duke, Viollet Le Duc put a spire up there again. So it wasn't there from beginning to end. It was off again, on again.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay. Thank you.
Elaine, one thing I wanted to say, and I had to look back at my copy of the book to remember, was when Victor Hugo wrote about Notre Dame, he argued that that was the finest piece of architecture, the finest expression of humanity that had ever been built. And his argument was that the printing press had taken away from architecture that ability to express. And so the printing press replaced architecture as how humans expressed themselves. So I don't know. I don't remember the part exactly if he was blaming the architects for all of the maladies that had occurred to it over the centuries, but I do remember that, which I think is also pertinent.
Yeah, it's an interesting idea, isn't it? And particularly since he was a writer. Printing press was important to him.
Yeah.
Oh, what a wonderful, wonderful question and answer period. It's always a sign of a really interesting paper. So congratulations, Elaine. Any other last questions as we wrap up?
Well, I just want to add that Mark Domke is just a genius. The best photos of the cathedral in its good shape were taken by Mark.
Oh, hi. Yes.
He took those in September of 2018, before the fire. Many of the pictures of the fire exactly happening were taken by a friend of mine who's a French historian who happened to be in Paris, standing there when the fire broke out. And so she wrote to me and she told me about, you know, what they experienced and how it got so hot they had to get away from the square and so on. And then the pictures of the cathedral now were taken by my friend Peter, who has been an organist and composer and has been involved with many concerts in Notre Dame. And he now lives in Cluny, but he had come back to Paris last year and took those photos. So I have a lot of thanks to everybody, but particularly to Mark, who is such a gem when it comes to helping with putting together these Zooms. Yeah.
Great.
I agree. We'll go ahead and close, but thank you again for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
I agree, bravo.